Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming at you again. Today we're going to be taking a look at a APUSH video focusing in on topic 3.12, which is taking a look at movement in the early republic. So we're taking a look at, as we start to wind down the 18th century and as America has now come into its own as its own independent country, what is happening in terms of migration and immigration. So movement within the United States and immigration to the United States. First off, if we're talking about some of the domestic movements, the migration, keep in mind what had started as a trickle during the latter colonial era now becomes a deluge of Americans now moving west of the Appalachian Mountains, moving into the Great Lakes region, moving into the Ohio River Valley. A lot of this is going to be spurred by the Northwest Ordinance in 1787 that is going to kind of organize these new territories. The Land Ordinance 2 years prior to that had organized the counties and the townships. So it seems that this is now an area that has been organized politically. As we'll get into in a moment, Native Americans have been defeated militarily, so it has been pacified. So it seems like open, organized land for lots of new opportunity for lots of Americans. So this is where we really start to see a lot of folks moving into Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, things like that. Now, speaking of Native Americans, keep in mind once again that Native Americans are going to be on the losing end of things militarily as we go through American history. What had started out as military defeat on the East Coast in the 17th century is now going to be meaning by the end of the 18th century defeat for the most part in the areas between the Mississippi River and the Appalachians. Now, it's not totally done yet. You're still going to have the Battle of Tippecanoe, for example, and you're still going to have the Black Hawk War and things like that. But we are now starting to see what is the beginning of the end of Native American dominance in what is the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region. Also keep in mind that with the passage of the Indian Intercourse Act, it is going to be stipulating very explicitly that it is only the federal government's authority to be able to negotiate with Native American tribes in terms of land treaties and things like that. Once again, the Constitution stipulates that Native nations are to be viewed as independent countries, almost like European countries. So, that's kind of why that is the case. That being said, though, a lot of state and local governments, kind of created their own deals with Native tribes locally. But officially, any kind of treaties, negotiations are to be done by the federal government. Now, once again, we kind of mentioned this previously, but Native Americans are going to be losing on the battlefield. Near modern-day Toledo, Ohio, you can see the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And note, this is happening right around the same time as the ratification of Jay's Treaty, which is between the United States and the British. And in that treaty, remember, the British will actually not only agree on paper to remove any remaining force that they had on American territory, but will actually start to do that. And that's going to be significant because British proximity within the United States is going to allow many of these native tribes to have access to weapons to be able to fight off American migrants. Now that's going to start to go away. So the British influence is going to start to recede a little bit. Native American ability in the Great Lakes region and the Ohio River Valley to militarily stand up to white migrants is going to decline as well. And so what we start to see happening is the very, very beginning. This is the very beginning of what will lead to eventually the reservation system. The idea being is, okay, you want, as the American government, you want access to this fertile soil in the Ohio River Valley, but you've got Native Americans already there. It's not enough to just move them out of the way, but to put them on pieces of land that you at least seem to, at the moment, believe would be protected from American development. And that's what these reservations are going to be. The assumption is that you could have land for white people and then you could have land for Native Americans. Once again, sending the message that white people didn't really have any interest in living with Native Americans, but the idea that you could have separate territory for each of these folks. But as we will go through the next 100 years, Native American reservations are going to be constantly being moved. Native Americans are going to be moved onto even worse pieces of land due to, for example, in the future, finding oil, finding gold, silver, etc. But this very beginning process of putting Native Americans on fixed pieces of land to restrict their movements, to restrict their freedom, and to assert American dominance, that does start right around 1800. Now, as the American government is further restricting Native Americans, you actually see the Spanish doing something a little different. The Spanish are actually encouraging Native Americans to enter into their territories, particularly Florida, as a means of trying to blunt any kind of American movement into those territories. Remember, it's not just the natives that are worried about American expansion, it is also the Spanish, who are now our primary neighbors to the south and west. Additionally, be noticeable of some other key population changes. Immigration to the United States from Europe is still going to be continuing, though limited. And it's still going to be, for the most part, British immigrants, Western European immigrants from France, from the Netherlands, Scotland, places like that for the most part. We don't really see a big influx of Germans and Irish just yet, although we will by the time we get to the antebellum era. Also note that African forced migration to the United States is going to be continuing as well, even though there was a moratorium for a while during the Revolutionary War era. The return to the slave trade, the global slave trade, will be coming back, though note that the Constitution, in an attempt to try to find a middle ground on what is now starting to become more of a controversial issue socially and politically, slavery, a deal was made at the Constitutional Convention to allow Congress, 20 years after the Constitution goes into effect, to decide to ban slave importation if they so desired. And that will happen. So slave importation will continue for another 20 years after the Constitution is ratified, stopping in 1808. Something else that has defined America going back to colonial times will continue to happen, and that is a very strong and robust birth rate here in the United States, especially in frontier areas, rural farming areas, places like that. The general idea being is that with more pregnancies, more births, that means more hands to work on farms. And once again, remember, this is overwhelmingly still a rural farming society, overwhelmingly. Now, focusing in a little bit more on slavery for just a moment, we'd mentioned previously that when we get to the Revolutionary War, there was a sense that slavery was kind of on its way out, that it was not proving, at least in its current form, to be as profitable as it had hoped to be for many in the United States, particularly those in northern colonies and then eventually northern states. And this is going to fit in nicely and neatly with those that, from a moral, social, and political perspective, wanted to see slavery eventually abolished. But there was a general sense that you didn't have to be super aggressive in terms of policy to end slavery, because it seemed that, for economic reasons, it was going to kind of, end itself. But as we mentioned previously, Eli Whitney's cotton gin is going to change all that. And through this technological innovation, it's going to then create more of a necessity for slaves, because cotton production is going to be much easier to achieve. And the easier and cheaper it is to produce cotton with slave labor is going to lead to cheaper products that are going to be made from raw cotton, transferred to northern textile mills to make clothing, to make tablecloths, you name it. So bottom line, by the time we get to 1800, what seemed to be an institution of evil that was working its way out of existence is now starting to make a resurgence. And that then is going to lead to what is really going to be the defining domestic issue for the next 65, 70 years. And that is the existence of slavery, and more importantly, the future of slavery in the new emerging Western territories and states. So, please, stay tuned for those conflicts. Keep in mind also that when we do talk about the migration patterns of African Americans within the United States, as slavery is starting to become more popular in the southern states and less popular in the northern states and less popular globally, we're going to be seeing, as we get into the 19th century, more and more European countries abolishing slavery for moral reasons, including Britain and Canada. So we're going to be seeing those that are in the South, enslaved, that are African Americans. We're going to see a growing number of folks trying to escape slavery by either escaping into northern states north of the Ohio River, north of the Mason-Dixon line, or trying to escape into other countries like, British Canada, etc., to try to avoid the institution of slavery. That being said, though, slavery is becoming more and more popular, not just in the South as a whole, but becoming more popular in what we would call the Deep South or the Lower South. Places like Alabama, the Alabama Territory, the Mississippi Territory, already pre-existing states like South Carolina and Georgia are going to be seeing growing numbers of slaves, mostly because the Deep South is where cotton is going to be most plentiful to be grown. In other words, the conditions will be most favorable for cotton to be grown there, more of a desire for cotton, hence more of a desire for slaves. And we'll talk more about this as we go through the 19th century, but this kind of marks the beginning of what's going to be a divide between the Upper South, which is going to be a little less reliant on slave labor, a little less reliant on the production of cotton, versus the Deep South, which is going to be more reliant on the production of cotton and therefore more reliant on slave labor. And of course, we know that the institution of slavery is evil and dehumanizing on many, many levels. And one of those examples is that slavery forces movement, not just movement in terms of transatlantic, middle passage trade, and not just in terms of moving an individual from one place to another, but it also, this industry will lead to forced movements that will separate families, husbands and wives, mothers and children, siblings will be at a moment's notice following a slave auction, potentially separated from their loved ones, never to see them again. Once again, you can never seemingly run out of examples of how evil and despicable and dehumanizing the institution of slavery was. Here's, to kind of round this out, here's a little bit more data showing, the percentage of folks enslaved in 1790 in some of these selected southern states. And note, even though Virginia is still going to have a pretty decent amount of slaves, mostly due to tobacco production, if you take a look at the two most southern states at the time, South Carolina and Georgia, they have much higher rates of slaves than more northern states in that region like Maryland and North Carolina. Once again, just at this very early stage, showing this growing popularity in the development of cotton and therefore more popularity for the institution of slavery. So anyhow, we're going to leave it right there. Once again, this is taking a look at immigration patterns in the United States and domestic migration patterns during the early republic. Okay? Until next time, we'll see you. Bye-bye.